Sleep.
Really?
When you got three small children, sleep was an important part of my life.
At 7:30 a.m. on December 2nd, Prince William released a statement that stopped the nation mid-breath. It wasn't delivered through standard palace channels, wasn't written in the careful bureaucratic language typically used for royal communications. It was personal, direct, and devastating. My father, His Majesty King Charles, has been diagnosed with a progressive condition affecting his ability to fulfill his duties in the manner he wishes. We face this as a family with courage, but I must be honest with you, the prognosis requires us to prepare for significant changes ahead. Within minutes, Britain went silent. Then the world erupted. Because William hadn't just announced his father was ill, he'd revealed something the monarchy had tried desperately to conceal for months, that King Charles was facing a health crisis serious enough to fundamentally alter the future of the crown. The announcement. The statement that appeared on the Prince of Wales's official platforms at 7:03 a.m. was unlike any royal health announcement in modern history. Typically, news about a monarch's condition comes through Buckingham Palace, filtered through press secretaries and private secretaries, carefully worded to provide information while maintaining institutional dignity. But this statement bore William's personal seal, was written in first person, and carried an emotional weight that protocol would normally strip away. I am writing to you directly because the matter concerns not just a king, but my father, William's statement began. Over recent months, my father has been experiencing health challenges that he initially believed were manageable alongside his duties. However, following comprehensive medical consultations, we have learned that his condition is more serious than initially understood. He has been diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition that will, over time, affect his capacity to maintain the demanding schedule that kingship requires. The statement continued with details that made medical professionals reading it immediately understand the gravity. While specific diagnosis is being withheld for privacy considerations, I can share that my father faces a condition that will progressively impact motor function, speech clarity, and sustained physical endurance. His cognitive abilities remain sharp, his spirit remains strong, but the physical demands of monarchy, the travel, the standing engagements, the relentless schedule, these will become increasingly difficult. William then addressed what everyone was thinking but afraid to ask. My father remains your king and will continue in his role for as long as he is able. However, we must be realistic and prepared. In the coming months, you will see adjustments to his schedule, increased delegation of responsibilities, and my taking on additional duties to support him and ensure continuity of the Crown's work. This is not abdication, this is adaptation, but it is adaptation born of medical necessity, not choice. The statement concluded with William's characteristic blend of formality and genuine emotion. I ask for your understanding, your compassion, and your continued support for my father during this challenging time. He has given his life to service, and that commitment has not wavered, even as his body begins to limit what service can look like. Please respect our family's privacy as we navigate this together, while trusting that we will keep you informed of significant developments. William, Prince of Wales. The reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. Within 10 minutes, every major British broadcaster had interrupted regular programming. The BBC assembled royal correspondents, medical experts, and constitutional scholars in real time. ITV cleared its morning schedule entirely. Sky News ran continuous coverage with the Chiron King's health crisis. Prince William issues personal statement. International response was equally swift. CNN went live with breaking news coverage. American networks that rarely covered royal affairs led their morning shows with the announcement. European broadcasters treated it as a continental concern, recognizing that Britain's constitutional stability affected broader alliances and relationships. And in Commonwealth nations from Canada to Australia, the news dominated every platform, as citizens of the broader royal realm processed that their shared monarch was facing a crisis that would reshape the institution. At Buckingham Palace, the response was controlled chaos. Senior staff had been briefed moments before William's statement went live, But the decision to have William make the announcement rather than using traditional palace channels had created complications. Switchboards were immediately overwhelmed. Press officers scrambled to coordinate responses to media inquiries flooding in from around the world. And constitutional advisors began the complex work of ensuring that whatever transitions might become necessary were legally sound and procedurally proper. At Kensington Palace, William had been awake since 5 a.m., working with a small team to finalize the statement. Catherine had been beside him throughout, reading drafts, offering suggestions, providing the steady support that had defined their partnership. When the statement went live, William had sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly, and said to those present, "There was no good way to do this, but at least it's done honestly." Catherine had placed her hand on his shoulder, a simple gesture captured by no cameras but witnessed by staff who would later describe it as a moment of profound partnership. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, the weight William now carried. He wasn't just announcing his father's illness, he was announcing his own imminent elevation to a role he'd been born to fill, but hoped wouldn't come this soon. At Clarence House, King Charles had been informed the statement was going live at 6:50 a.m. He'd reviewed the final draft the night before, had suggested only minor adjustments, and had ultimately approved William's decision to speak personally rather than through institutional channels. When the statement went public, Charles was sitting in his private study with Camilla, and those present reported that he'd closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the reality that his private health struggle was now public knowledge, and that the countdown to transition had effectively begun. By mid-morning, Downing Street had issued a statement of support. The Prime Minister expressed the nation's thoughts and prayers for His Majesty, praised William's transparency, and assured the public that constitutional continuity was secure. Parliament would be briefed in closed session later that day. And throughout Britain, from cities to villages, people processed the news with a mixture of sympathy, sadness, and the sobering recognition that they were witnessing the beginning of the end of a reign that had barely begun. The timeline that led here. The health crisis that William announced on December 3rd hadn't emerged suddenly. It had been building for months, revealing itself through small signs that were initially dismissed, rationalized, or hidden from public view. Understanding how the palace arrived at this moment requires tracing back through a timeline of medical concerns, family observations, and increasingly alarming consultations that culminated in a diagnosis no one wanted to hear. The first signs had appeared in late spring 2025, though no one recognized them as significant at the time. Charles had always been energetic, perhaps even restless, someone who filled every moment with activity and purpose. But staff began noticing subtle changes. He would occasionally stumble on steps he'd climbed thousands of times. His handwriting, usually precise despite his age, became less controlled. And during long speeches, his voice would sometimes weaken in ways that seemed beyond normal fatigue. Camilla noticed before anyone else. During a private dinner in June, Charles had reached for a glass of water and knocked it over, something so out of character for someone usually careful in his movements. She'd laughed it off in the moment, but later that night, she'd mentioned to a lady in waiting that Charles seemed unusually clumsy lately. The observation was noted but not elevated. Charles was 75 years old, recently crowned, carrying enormous responsibility. Some physical decline was expected. By July, the signs had become harder to dismiss. During a state visit to Germany, Charles had difficulty with a ceremonial sword during an official function, his grip not quite firm enough to hold it steadily. Royal protection officers, trained to notice even minor changes in their principles, began quietly documenting instances of what they termed reduced motor precision. Not enough to suggest immediate concern, but enough to establish a pattern. William had noticed during a private meeting in August. He'd been briefing his father on Commonwealth matters when Charles had struggled to sign a routine document, his signature trailing off mid-word. When William asked if everything was all right, Charles had dismissed it as tiredness, but William saw something in his father's eyes that troubled him. Not confusion, but awareness. Charles knew something was wrong, and he was trying to hide it. The turning point came in early September when Charles's private physician, Dr. Richard Aston, insisted on comprehensive neurological evaluation after Charles had experienced what he described as unusual stiffness in his left hand during morning correspondence. Charles had resisted, arguing he simply needed rest after a busy summer schedule. But Camilla, increasingly alarmed by what she was observing, had essentially forced the issue. "If you won't do the tests for yourself, do them for me. I need to know what we're facing." The initial neurological consultation took place at a private London clinic on September 15th. Charles was examined by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, one of Britain's leading neurologists, who conducted a series of tests examining motor function, speech patterns, coordination, and reflexes. The results were concerning enough that she recommended additional testing, including MRI scans and specialized assessments that would take several weeks to complete. During this period, the palace maintained complete secrecy. Charles continued his public schedule, though aides began quietly reducing the most physically demanding elements. Camilla accompanied him to everything, not just for ceremonial reasons, but to provide discreet support if needed, and William was briefed after each medical consultation, understanding that as heir, he needed to be prepared for whatever diagnosis might emerge. The definitive diagnosis came on October 23rd, delivered during a private meeting at Clarence House. Dr. Mitchell, accompanied by two specialists, explained that Charles was showing early to moderate stages of a progressive neurological condition. They were careful in their language, noting that progression rates varied significantly between patients, but the trajectory was clear. Motor function would continue to decline, speech might be affected, and the physical stamina required for royal duties would become increasingly difficult to maintain. Charles's immediate response, according to those present, was questions about timeline. "How long do I have before this becomes unmanageable?" The doctors were honest but necessarily vague. With treatment and lifestyle adjustments, potentially years of functional capacity. But the demanding schedule of monarchy, the constant travel, the hours of standing during ceremonies, these would need adjustment much sooner. Camilla, sitting beside Charles, had asked the question everyone was thinking: how long before the public will notice? The doctors suggested that with careful management, perhaps 6 months to a year before the changes became obvious enough to generate speculation. But they emphasized that stress and overexertion would accelerate decline. Charles would need to choose between maintaining current pace and hastening his own deterioration. The weeks following diagnosis were marked by what staff later described as Charles's attempt to outwork the disease. He seemed determined to prove the diagnosis wrong, filling his schedule even more aggressively than usual, as if sheer willpower could overcome physical limitation. It was Camilla who finally intervened during a late November argument that staff could hear through closed doors. "You're not proving anything except that you're scared, and I understand that. But killing yourself with work doesn't change the diagnosis. It just means you'll have less time to do the things that actually matter." That conversation, painful as it was, shifted something in Charles. He began accepting that adaptation was necessary, that denial was cowardice dressed as courage, and he began the difficult process of planning for a future where his role would necessarily diminish, where William would need to step forward, where the transition everyone had assumed was decades away might actually be years, or even months from beginning. By early December, the palace faced an impossible choice: continue hiding Charles's condition and risk it being discovered through leaked medical records or obvious public symptoms, or control the narrative by disclosing it on their terms. Charles, after extensive discussions with William, Camilla, and Anne, made the decision that transparency, however painful, was preferable to deception. And William, understanding the weight his father was carrying, offered to make the announcement himself, to spare Charles the burden of announcing his own declining health to a nation that had only recently welcomed his reign. The family crisis behind closed doors. The family gathering that took place at Windsor Castle on December 1st, 2 days before William's announcement, was unlike any the royals had experienced in living memory. This wasn't a celebratory occasion or routine planning session. This was a family confronting the reality that their patriarch, who'd waited 70 years to become king, would potentially have only a fraction of that time to serve in the role he'd spent his life preparing for. William had arrived first, driving himself from Kensington Palace in the early morning darkness. He'd left Catherine with the children, promising to brief her fully after the meeting. As he walked through Windsor's ancient corridors, he felt the weight of what was coming. This meeting would formalize what everyone had been avoiding, that his father's reign would be measured in years rather than decades, and that William's preparation for kingship needed to accelerate dramatically. Princess Anne arrived shortly after, her face set in the composed mask she wore during crises. She'd been briefed on Charles's diagnosis weeks earlier, had processed it with her characteristic pragmatism, but today would require more than pragmatism. Today would require navigating the emotional devastation of watching her older brother face mortality, while the institution demanded they plan for continuity. Camilla had been at Windsor throughout, having spent the previous day with Charles as he prepared for this family discussion. Staff reported she looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tiredness that comes from weeks of maintaining composure while privately falling apart. She'd been Charles's rock through the diagnosis, the consultations, the treatment discussions, but even rocks crack under sufficient pressure, and those close to her worried about what this sustained crisis was costing her own health. Charles entered last, moving more carefully than he once had, a slight stiffness in his gait that was now impossible not to notice once you knew what to look for. He looked older than his 75 years, but his eyes were clear, focused, and determined. He'd spent his life preparing for monarchy, and he would face this challenge with the same sense of duty that had defined his entire existence. The meeting began with Charles himself laying out the medical reality. Dr. Mitchell had briefed him on best-case and worst-case scenarios. Best case, with aggressive treatment and reduced schedule, he might maintain functional capacity for 3 to 5 years. Worst case, deterioration could accelerate, making public duties impossible within 12 to 18 months. The most likely outcome fell somewhere between a gradual decline that would require increasing delegation until formal transition became necessary. William absorbed this information with visible difficulty. 3 to 5 years sounded like a gift until you considered that his father had been king for less than 3 years. The reign everyone had anticipated might last 2 decades could be over before the end of the decade. And while William had been preparing for kingship his entire life, preparation and reality were vastly different things. Anne's response was characteristically practical. "We need clear succession protocols," she said firmly. "Not because we're rushing you out, Charles, but because uncertainty creates vulnerability. If your condition worsens suddenly, we can't have constitutional confusion about how transition occurs." Charles nodded his agreement, though the sadness in his eyes was evident. The conversation turned to immediate adjustments. Charles would reduce his schedule by approximately 30%, focusing on essential constitutional duties and delegating ceremonial functions to working royals. William would formally take on additional responsibilities, effectively serving as a co-monarch in all but name. Anne would expand her already extensive patronage work to cover areas Charles could no longer manage. And Camilla would continue her role while also serving as Charles's primary support through treatment. But the most difficult part of the meeting came when they discussed Harry. Should he be informed? Should he be invited back for a family meeting? Should the diagnosis be used as opportunity for reconciliation? The room fell into uncomfortable silence. Finally, Charles spoke. "He's my son. He deserves to know. But I won't use my illness as leverage for family healing. If Harry wants to return, it must be genuine, not obligation born of guilt." William's jaw tightened, but he nodded. He would make the call to Harry, would inform him of their father's diagnosis, would make clear that family connection remained available if Harry chose to accept it on terms that didn't require validating years of public accusations. It would be perhaps the most difficult phone call of William's life, navigating between his role as son, brother, and future king. The discussion about telling George, Charlotte, and Louis was equally painful. The children, now 12, 9, and 6, were old enough to understand that their grandfather was unwell, but young enough that the full implications of progressive illness and early succession might be traumatic. Catherine would need to be central to those conversations, helping them process both personal grief over their grandfather's condition and the reality that their father would become king far sooner than anyone anticipated. Before the meeting concluded, Charles made a request that surprised everyone. He wanted to be involved in preparing William's announcement. He wanted to ensure the message was honest but not hopeless, transparent but not defeating. "I've spent my life waiting for this role," he said quietly. "I won't spend whatever time I have left pretending I'm not losing it, but I also won't let my illness be the only thing people remember about my reign." The meeting ended with an unusual moment of physical affection. Anne, not typically demonstrative, hugged her brother tightly. Camilla's eyes were wet with tears she'd been holding back for weeks. And William, standing beside his father, placed a hand on Charles's shoulder with a gentleness that spoke volumes about the bond between them, complicated though it had sometimes been. As they dispersed to begin implementing the plans they'd discussed, everyone carried the same knowledge. They'd just formalized the beginning of the end of King Charles's reign. And while duty demanded they plan for continuity, humanity demanded they grieve for time that had been stolen, for a reign that would never fulfill its potential, for a father and king who deserved more years than his body would allow. The decision to go public. The debate about whether and how to disclose Charles's condition consumed 48 hours of intense discussion, revealing fundamental tensions between traditional palace discretion and modern demands for transparency. The meeting that ultimately decided the approach took place on December 2nd, in a secure room at Buckingham Palace where constitutional matters of the highest sensitivity were typically discussed. Present were King Charles, Prince William, Queen Camilla, Princess Anne, the palace's senior legal advisor, the communications director, and the private secretary. The question before them was deceptively simple. How much should the public know, and how should they learn it? The traditional approach would have been a brief palace statement, noting that His Majesty was experiencing health challenges requiring schedule adjustments, with details withheld for privacy reasons. This had been the standard practice for generations. Queen Elizabeth's health had been largely shielded from public view until her final days. King George's serious illnesses had been disclosed in only the vaguest terms. The assumption had always been that royal privacy, particularly regarding medical matters, outweighed public interest. But the communications director argued that approach was no longer viable. "We live in an era of unprecedented transparency," she explained. "Medical privacy is less protected, leaks are more common, and public tolerance for institutional secrecy has eroded. If we issue a vague statement, speculation will run wild, rumors will circulate, and when truth eventually emerges, which it will, we'll have lost credibility by appearing to hide it." Anne agreed forcefully. "The Queen's death taught us that maintaining fiction until the last possible moment creates chaos. People felt deceived when they learned how seriously ill she was. We can't repeat that pattern with Charles. The public has a right to understand the situation, not in medical minutiae, but in general terms that allow them to process what's coming." But Charles himself was conflicted. Discussing his declining health publicly felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging that the role he'd waited for decades to fulfill was already slipping from his grasp. "There's dignity in privacy," he argued. "There's something to be said for maintaining the mystique of monarchy, not exposing every human frailty to public consumption." It was William who articulated the position that ultimately prevailed. "With respect, Father, the mystique is already gone. Social media, 24-hour news cycles, the reality is that privacy is an illusion we maintain at increasing cost to credibility. People don't want mysterious royals anymore. They want authentic humans who take on extraordinary responsibilities. Your illness doesn't diminish you. Hiding it might." The question then became who should make the announcement. Palace protocol suggested a formal statement from the King's office, written in third person, maintaining institutional distance from personal circumstances. But William pushed for a different approach. "Let me do it," he'd said. "Let me speak as your son and as heir. People need to hear this from someone they trust to be honest. and they need to see that the family is facing this together, not that the institution is managing a problem. Charles had initially resisted. It places too much burden on you. You shouldn't have to announce your father's failing health. But Camilla, surprisingly, had supported William's position. He's right. If this comes from faceless palace bureaucracy, it feels cold, managed. If it comes from William personally, it feels human. And in this moment, humanity is what people need. The legal advisor weighed in with practical considerations. Any announcement must be carefully worded to avoid constitutional complications. We must be clear that His Majesty remains king and intends to continue in that role. We cannot create impression that succession is imminent or that capacity is impaired. The line between acknowledging serious illness and suggesting inability to rule is narrow but critical. The final decision was made through a kind of exhausted consensus. William would issue a personal statement written in first person, disclosing that Charles had been diagnosed with a progressive condition affecting his physical capacity but not his cognitive function or constitutional standing. The statement would be honest about challenges ahead while emphasizing continuity of duty. And it would be released early morning, allowing time for media to process and report before markets opened and avoiding the chaos of breaking news during peak hours. Charles made one final request. I want to see the final draft. I want to approve every word. This is my health, my reign, and my relationship with my people. William can deliver the message, but I must be comfortable with the message being delivered. That night, father and son sat together in Charles's study, reviewing draft after draft, adjusting phrases, ensuring the tone struck the impossible balance between honesty and hope. By midnight, they had a statement both could accept. It would tell difficult truths. It would acknowledge uncertainty ahead, but it would also reaffirm commitment to service and confidence in the institution's resilience. As they finalized it, Charles had looked at his son and said quietly, "You'll make a fine king. I'm only sorry you'll have to do it sooner than either of us wanted." William's response was simply to grip his father's hand, a moment of connection that spoke more than any words could. At 7:03 a.m. on December 3rd, William released the statement that would change everything, the aftermath and what comes next. The 72 hours following William's announcement revealed a nation and institution scrambling to adjust to a reality no one had been prepared to face. The careful plans made in private meetings now had to be implemented in full public view, with every decision scrutinized and every change interpreted as harbinger of transition. The constitutional implications were managed with remarkable efficiency. The Privy Council was convened in emergency session to be briefed on the situation and assured of continuity. While the king's illness was serious, his constitutional capacity remained intact. He could still grant royal assent, could still fulfill the formal requirements of sovereignty. What was changing was the physical and ceremonial dimension of kingship. The endless schedule of appearances, the stamina-demanding state visits, the hours of standing during official functions. Within 48 hours, palace officials had restructured the royal calendar for the next 6 months. Charles would maintain constitutional duties, the weekly meetings with the Prime Minister, the signing of legislation, the formal audiences that defined sovereign authority. But ceremonial functions were being redistributed. William would represent the crown at most state dinners. Anne would take on additional military patronages. Even Edward and Sophie found their schedules expanding to cover duties Charles could no longer manage. The public response was overwhelming in its sympathy. Buckingham Palace reported receiving over 100,000 messages of support within the first day. Flowers appeared at palace gates, left by citizens wanting to express solidarity with their ailing king. Churches across Britain held special services, and television coverage, after initial shock wore off, settled into respectful analysis of Charles's legacy and compassionate discussion of his challenges ahead. International reaction was equally supportive. World leaders issued statements praising Charles's service and expressing hopes for his health. Commonwealth nations, from Canada to Australia, grappled with the reality that their shared monarch was facing a condition that would likely shorten his reign. and European royal families connected by blood and history to the British throne reached out privately with support and understanding born of having faced similar crises within their own institutions. But the most significant adjustments were happening within the family itself. William's responsibilities had expanded overnight from heir apparent to de facto co-monarch. He was now attending Privy Council meetings regularly, being briefed on classified security matters, and serving as the Crown's primary representative at international functions. The transition he'd been slowly preparing for had been dramatically accelerated, compressed from decades into months. Catherine found herself thrust into a more prominent role as well. With William's schedule expanding, she became the primary parent for daily routines with George, Charlotte, and Louis, while also taking on additional patronages and public duties. Friends described her as handling the pressure with characteristic grace, but the weight was evident. She'd signed up to eventually be queen consort, but eventually was supposed to be 20 years away, not 2 or 3. For George specifically, the implications were profound. At 12 years old, he was now watching his grandfather's decline while understanding that his own father would become king much sooner than anyone anticipated. Palace educators were providing him with additional briefings on royal history and constitutional matters, accelerating his preparation for a future that had suddenly become more immediate. The boy who should have had decades of normal childhood was being gently but inexorably pushed toward understanding the weight he would one day carry. The situation with Harry created perhaps the most complicated dynamics. William had called him on December 2nd before the announcement, informing him of their father's diagnosis and inviting him to return to Britain if he wished. Harry's response, according to sources familiar with the conversation, was conflicted. He expressed concern for his father's health and asked medical questions William couldn't answer. But when William suggested Harry might want to visit, to see Charles while he was still relatively healthy, Harry had hesitated. The wounds from years of public conflict, the accusations made and boundaries crossed, couldn't be erased by a health crisis, however serious. Meghan's position was even more complicated. She'd spent years painting the royal family as irredeemably hostile to her. Now her father-in-law was seriously ill, and any public response she made would be scrutinized for sincerity. She and Harry eventually released a brief statement expressing their thoughts and support for the king, carefully worded to sound compassionate without suggesting reconciliation or return. It satisfied no one but offended no one, which was perhaps the best they could manage under circumstances. As December continued, the palace established new routines designed to protect Charles while maintaining institutional continuity. He would work mornings when his energy was highest, focus on essential duties, and rest aggressively in afternoons. His public appearances would be carefully staged to minimize physical demands, and William would shadow every significant decision, ensuring seamless transition if Charles's condition worsened suddenly. The medical prognosis remained uncertain. Charles's treatment plan included medications to slow progression, physical therapy to maintain mobility, and speech therapy to address emerging vocal challenges. His doctors were cautiously optimistic that with proper management, he might maintain functional capacity for several years. But everyone understood that progressive neurological conditions were unpredictable, that best-case scenarios often failed to materialize, and that preparing for the worst while hoping for the best was the only realistic approach. What had become clear was that Britain was entering a transitional period unprecedented in modern royal history. They had a king who was physically declining but mentally sharp, an heir who was effectively sharing sovereign responsibilities, and a nation trying to balance sympathy for Charles's situation with practical recognition that William's reign was approaching far sooner than anyone had anticipated. The monarchy was demonstrating its capacity to adapt to human frailty while maintaining institutional stability. But the cost of that adaptation, measured in Charles's lost time and the family's accelerated grief, was achingly high. By the end of the first week, a new normal had emerged. Charles remained king but was increasingly symbolic. William was functioning as regent in all but name, and everyone, from palace staff to ordinary citizens, was adjusting to the reality that they were witnessing not just a health crisis, but the beginning of a transition that would reshape the crown for generations to come. As the shock of William's announcement began settling into somber acceptance, the story revealed truths that extended far beyond royal walls or constitutional procedures. What this moment illuminated was the fundamental tension between institutional immortality and human mortality. The crown is forever, the saying goes, but the people who wear it are heartbreakingly temporary. Charles had waited 70 years for his role, had prepared more thoroughly than any heir in history, and now faced the cruel reality that illness would steal much of the time he'd spent a lifetime earning. For William, the tragedy was different but equally profound. He would become king far sooner than expected, ready in skill but robbed of the luxury of gradual transition. The weight was descending years before it should, and no amount of preparation could make that burden lighter. Yet within the tragedy lived something achingly human. A family facing illness together, setting aside previous conflicts, remembering that beneath the crowns and protocols were people who loved each other, however imperfectly. Charles's diagnosis hadn't healed all wounds, but it had reminded everyone that time was finite, that grudges were luxuries none of them could afford, and that whatever came next would be faced together or not at all. The most profound lesson was universal. Institutions endure, but lives are brief. Duty continues, but people are fragile. And sometimes the greatest courage isn't in how we serve, but in how we face the limits of our service with dignity, honesty, and grace. Thank you for staying with this story. Sometimes the saddest truths teach us what matters most, not the roles we play, but how we hold each other when those roles become too heavy to carry alone.